Yeah, so the FDA released this draft guidance on medical devices containing AI functionality earlier this year. So I thought it would be good to spend some time going over it and looking at some of the sections in more detail. Yeah, so this diagram here is actually taken from a blog post. It's kind of showing the AI lifecycle, but it's kind of a lot of what the document is about and how these parts of the AI lifecycle relate to the overall like product lifecycle. So I thought I would start by looking at kind of how what the FDA's activities on AI have been kind of recently, to sort of contextualize ourselves, and then give like just kind of an overview of the guidance itself, and then look at the cybersecurity section in more detail, and then I think that'll hopefully lead to some questions and discussions and opinions and things like that. So is this big enough for you all to see? I don't know if it matters all that much, but just in general.
I can see it.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so I was looking at the FDA's page where they have a lot of what they've done related to AI. And I've looked at the page before and kind of dove into the different resources, but I put it together into more of a timeline. And what I noticed is they've kind of spent the last, I guess, 2019 is 6 years ago now. I was gonna say the last few years, but it's been longer than that. The last like 5 or 6 years, it looks like they've been focused on how you can change your device after it's been cleared, or how do you propose how you'll do that when you do your 510K submission or whatever. So we know that now as a predetermined change control plan. So this is one of their first things back in 2019. And then that there was draft guidance on that later on, and then eventually just last December, the actual guidance on that. And then in between there's just been kind of like a smattering of just kind of general thoughts, I think, like how they're kind of thinking about how people should develop AI. So these are like these guiding principle documents and things like that. So what does it actually contain? The recent guidance, it's a lot of recommendations for what submissions, 510K submissions, de novos, or whatever should contain if your device has AI functionality. And they actually have this term, artificial intelligence enabled device software functions. So if your device has anything like that, this is a guidance document saying what your submission should contain. Lots of recommendations. And they have some guiding principles that they kind of have been talking about a lot lately, which is a focus on just the overall product lifecycle. And I think it was actually a reorg too in, I think, not FDA, but maybe higher up than that, I forget. But there's a reorg kind of restructuring their organization based on this view of looking at things this way as like the total product lifecycle. So this is kind of like just a way of, I thought just to like kind of break it down visually in terms of the different aspects of a product's lifecycle. So there's development, and then these are all kind of related to AI too. Risk assessment, of course, how you describe and develop your model, how you manage the data related to training the model, things like that. That's, in the early part of the product lifecycle. How you validate it, how you manage the data related to that, how you describe it, how you present what the model does, how it achieves what it does, all those things to users. This guidance document has this notion of model cards, which I think is used a lot in industry, but kind of making its way into a recommendation on how to present things about a model. And they also have some, guidance on what the public submission summary should contain, the device description should contain, and then some things on post-market monitoring and things like that. So yeah, it's going from development all the way to post-market. And at the end, they actually kind of have like the breakdown of what the actual specifics are. So in practical terms, how we'd look at this and how it affects us and how we'd change, like, let's say we're trying to build out the documentation for a new software device and it has an AI function in it. We would look at these things here and go into, this is section V of this guidance, and we'd see what are the recommendations under this guidance, and then we place them in the submission under this section. And each of these sections, has quite a number of recommendations to it itself. I didn't look at all of these in detail. I looked at the cybersecurity one a little bit more so, but I did look at the performance monitoring one, the performance validation. This is actually incorrect. I'm sorry, this arrow should go here to performance monitoring. There was a note in this section, and I didn't see it. I don't know if anybody else saw a note on any of the other sections, but they say that it's recommended that you have performance monitoring, but it's only required if your device type has special controls for it. So if you have if people aren't aware of this, like for example, if your product type is LLZ, which means you just move images around, you just do image processing and interact with the packs maybe, and don't have AI, a special control for that product code under the regulations is that you can have a DICOM conformance, or you conform to DICOM somehow, and so for this, I wasn't really sure. I don't know if anybody knows what product type has regulations that specify post-market monitoring, but I was kind of happy to see that, because it seems like it would be kind of a difficult thing to monitor in a lot of cases, at least for the use cases I'm thinking about. But
it's interesting. I was thinking about this question the other day in the context of a possible de novo project, and I was actually looking for regulations that require post-market surveillance, but I couldn't find any. I didn't do like a comprehensive search, so I think it'd be interesting to propose that for a future if we do a de novo and we think monitoring would be good. Seems like FDA would be happy.
Yeah, and so I think I remember seeing somewhere. I've never been involved with the de novo myself. Does that end up creating a new product code, or does it slot into an existing one? Does it create a new regulation to correspond with the product code, or is that why you would propose new special controls, or would you be saying we should add special controls to an existing regulation in that circumstance?
Yeah, good question. So the way it works is if you're doing a de novo mainly because you don't think it's class 3, so you don't think it's a PMA, but there's not a predicate that you can predicate on, and so you actually are creating a new regulation, which may have one or more product codes, because the product code, you probably know some regulations only have one product code, but some regulations also have multiple product codes. But ultimately, the regulation is really the part that matters the most, because that's where the special controls are listed. But anyway, yeah, you would be you propose what you think the special controls should be to FDA, but they ultimately get to decide.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, yeah. So there's quite a bit that I think would be beneficial to add to the templates that we use for expediting our documentation process that would be related to AI based on these sections. So getting into cybersecurity, this slide is just kind of saying what they say. It's basically if your device is AI enabled and it meets the definition of a cyber device, there's some extra recommendations here to help meet the standards that are required. So they give some examples here, and I think these might be interesting to talk about. They give examples of potential cyber threats. So data poisoning, I didn't actually know what some of these terms meant, or I didn't know that these things had terms for them, I should say. So data poisoning, I think they're implying this would be like if somebody is able to manipulate data at training time to augment the behavior of the model. I can just go through these one by one, and in the next slide I have some just thoughts on them about how they would potentially be mitigated, and also how these things might come up or not come up in most of the use cases that we see. But for now, I'll just go through these and just kind of say what they are, just so everybody's on the same page. So data poisoning said that model inversion / stealing, that's related to if your model is, say, open on an API endpoint, and you can constantly ping that endpoint with different data to kind of collect your own training data to see how that model behaves and then copy it. Model evasion, this is a term that I hadn't heard before. It's in the description that they had in this guidance document. It was essentially the same as data poisoning, but not in the training scenario, but in the inference scenario. So basically somebody's augmenting, sorry, that's a bad word to use. Somebody's manipulating the data that's being sent as input to get a prediction. So if you have, say, like a benign image and you're sending it to a cancer classifier, you don't want somebody to manipulate that such that you get predicted as having cancer. That would be bad, right? Data leakage, this is just like not having your training data leak. Overfitting, a lot of these relate to if you have your model training in a context where it's pulling its training parameters or it's pulling its data from network sources, which isn't the case a lot of times for us. So overfitting, it's kind of hard to understand why that would be like a cyber threat. But that's like if somebody's like, let's say that your model training script lives in the cloud and it's pulling its training configuration from some database, and somebody tampers with that and say, hey, run for a bajillion iterations, or something that makes it overfit. That could be a cyber threat in this context. Model bias, similar kind of thing. And then performance drift. I don't remember exactly how they said that. Yeah, okay, so performance drift, what the FDA was suggesting was that if you're, actually a lot of these didn't really kind of spell it out, and I had to make some kind of guesses as to what they were thinking was the actual threat. And what I was thinking here is they were suggesting that if somebody just hit your endpoint, your model inference endpoint, or something like that, with a bunch of unrelated data, and your training process was just set up so that it was retraining automatically, let's say, without any quality control data that was sent to the model or something like that, that could be a maliciously induced performance drift, let's say. So that's, I think, what they were kind of getting at there. So yeah, I don't know what people think about these. I had some thoughts here, like data poisoning. A lot of times we do quality control on the training data, and we're not pulling in training data kind of on the fly from network requests. So there's not really like a tampering in transit or tampering at rest that we usually have to worry about, which isn't to say we wouldn't need to document that. And that's like one of the recommendations, that we have controls in place, or say access controls to the machine where training is happening, and saying that it's not pulling data from network requests. The model stealing, I don't know if a lot of times when in the applications that I'm familiar with, that the model endpoints themselves are user facing, but it seems like maybe rate limiting could be a mitigation for this. Encryption, if you have a web application or a cyber device, you're probably using encrypted communication anyhow. Yeah, overfitting, we don't really have a lot of use cases where we're pulling training job configuration from a database, but something to be aware of. I don't know, did anybody have any thoughts on these, or like any other threats, like cyber threats related to AI training, ML training, or ML inference?
I had just one note, which is that I was really surprised to see the number of cybersecurity threats that happened at training time, given that it seemed like, especially some of the more malicious ones, seems like it would require threat actors who understood your model even better than you did, if they were able to, maliciously manipulate predictions in that way. Like, it seems unrealistic it's not unrealistic. It seems like not the most high priority risk factor. So, but it seems like it's been a lot of time talking about it. I didn't know if I'm missing something, or if anyone else thought that.
No, I'm 100%. I think it's interesting. Like, I was reading the risk benefit guidance that's in the context of de novos, and one of the things they say in there is they really want you to focus on real risks that have actually happened. And then they make this comment, and I'm thinking about, like, in the context of this, I'm like, wow, have they ever seen any of these things happen? Because they seem really like pretty wild to think, like, they're like inserting training data just to have like a backdoor. Like, that's pretty cool. I mean,
I was thinking the same thing. If there was more time, I was thinking go out and look to see if there was any, instances of anything like this actually being reported. It seems kind of odd.
Yeah, it's like you can sit around and think of all sorts of stuff. And I mean, and maybe if it's really high severity, you think like, okay, but maybe we should think about this, but I don't know.
I'll say
So
that
some of it feels a little like over the top.
Yeah, it's sort of.
I don't know about within
I
the.
think the comment phase is still open. Maybe this would warrant writing a comment saying, "Hey, like, have we actually seen any of these?"
Yeah, where do these come from?
I don't know about within the medical industry specifically, but data poisoning definitely has happened. There's been some recent incidents with that, and I saw an interesting article on Hackaday that someone did a study of the exact percentage of training data that's necessary to trigger basically a poisoning incident, and it was much lower than you would think. It was like 0.001%. Because really what we're talking about is like a latent, I mean, it's also, I think, would be really hard to control for, because it's like introducing a latent bias that's somewhat hidden and hard to discover.
Yeah.
Would that like affect the weights of the data? Is that like related to data poisoning, or how would it turn into an issue if the data was poisoned? Just incorrect outputs? I mean, yeah, it's kind of
Yeah, I mean, you could,
nebulous.
yeah, you could have something where it comes back with just something wildly off, that because the data was correlated in a certain way in the training data, like, I don't know about for medicine, like, I don't know, like some diagnostic tool and it's trying to detect, or it's like giving advice for like diabetes and it's like chop off their arm or something. You know, like theoretically, some of that could be snuck in there.
I would imagine it'd be easier to make the ML model train so that it doesn't do its job, rather than like training it to like do something specifically. Like, let's say that you have like a watermark X under all the image data that you put in there, and then like when you go to run it in production, none of it has that, and then it just doesn't work. But still, it's like, I don't know. It's that.
The real world examples I've seen of data poisoning are like in image recognition algorithms, where like people make a sticker where if it stickers anywhere in the image, it'll always say it's a toaster no matter what's in the image, like stuff like that, where you're manipulating the output to a certain fixed result. But
Yeah, that would be the example I think of, like the runtime, where it's like you have a model that's already trained, and then it's supposed to recognize faces, or something like that, or stop signs, and because it has a black pixel in one spot, it says it's a squirrel or something.
There was one example that I've seen where like they added a very small amount of very specially crafted noise to an image. So a human looking at the image couldn't tell that there had been any there's like no visible indication that the image had been altered. But like, let's say, I think the classic example is like a picture of a cat, slight noise added, specially crafted noise added to the image, and then suddenly the model is actually even more certain that it's something else and not a cat. That's sort of like Reece's example of like, slapping a sticker on a stop sign and suddenly it's like a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit sign. But you could easily imagine that sort of happening also at training time, where somebody imperceptibly alters the training data. So even if the researchers went back and looked at all the images themselves, they wouldn't even be able to tell that anything had happened. And then suddenly, their model is just bonkers.
Yeah, it's more difficult for me to imagine the training time thing, because you need to know so much more about how the model is being trained and what you're doing to the data, how it's going to affect the model that's produced. But it seems like the runtime thing, where you're manipulating, these two probably kind of go hand in hand, and they seem both pretty easily mitigated by rate limiting and encryption, to me.
I agree. I mean, I think
also
the government, I think, is also reacting to like all these like basically China fears. Like suddenly there's all this awareness that, our telecommunications infrastructure is actually pretty deeply infiltrated. So like they're warning people, like, don't use SMS, use end-to-end encryption, all these other things. So, it's like operationally, like within our own personal networks, I'm pretty sure we don't do these things. Some of this is very tin hat-ish. I agree, tinfoil hat sort of thing. I'm sorry to interrupt somebody.
I was just going to say, I think the other controls here are at a higher level, right? Like more focused on the user needs and requirements. Like if the model is saying this patient you need to cut their arm off. Like at some point, you might want to have other risk control measures in your software that look at the output of the model and sanity check it with the full context. It's like a model in isolation versus a model in a medical device with more context as to what the prediction means and how it should be used. So there might be some broader things to take into account there too. I think I might have cut JP off though. Sorry, JP. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Oh, just something pretty minor. I guess assuming that you had the whole automated pipeline that would just retrain automatically on some sort of schedule, like maybe an automatic way of knowing that your data is correct is to hash the whole thing and just make sure the hashes, rehash it before training and then make sure they match and then off it goes. Otherwise, you take a second look at it.
Yeah, and I wonder if some of the focus here on a lot of the training time things and sort of like a lot of these issues are, or these potential issues are based on the assumption that you have this kind of like automated retraining pipeline. I mean, they don't say that explicitly, but I feel like that's really, from what I can tell, a lot of where this could only possibly come up. And I wonder if that's just because of the recent PCCP stuff where they maybe anticipate getting more automated retraining pipelines and they want to kind of get ahead of that. I don't know.
Do we know of any clients or products that use automated retraining in a medical device context?
As far as I know, this was a comment one of the FDA speakers made sometime last year. I forget where. There's hasn't been any devices cleared with automatic training. That obviously that could be different in the last few months because there's a new one. And by automatic, I'm assuming that means like on the device, like real time, like not like automatic, like in the back end. But
interesting. So I mean, a lot of this stuff, like it makes sense potentially, but it does seem like it's getting kind of burdensome to say for each of these potential threats that you can kind of conjure up that we have mitigations for. I wonder if there's like a kind of way to say in your models or your training process is like your training process is not part of a cyber device or something like that, so that you can kind of not have to be responsible for a new bulk of documenting risk controls that are.
I mean, I'm not saying that this is at all likely that this is happening at all right at the moment, but couldn't you make the argument that like by the time we get training data, usually it's passed through like multiple people's hands, like we're getting it from a third-party vendor like Radiant Health, or like a client is providing it. Usually it's, been sourced from like a study and then they're de-identifying and is going through these multiple points. Couldn't you make the argument that there could be a supply chain attack, just like how there is on software dependencies, that the images have been tampered with?
That's a cool idea. Like one of these data vendor companies, like if they get hacked and then I'm just spitballing here, but like they have some script installed that like is like any I don't know, it's like playing with the pixels to make it work a certain way. I don't know.
Yes, I guess that's another possible way for data poisoning to occur, right? I was only thinking about it in the online retraining scenario.
I think the FDA, is I think they're trying to be a very forward-looking organization. And I think, we think of medical AI as being of a certain scale, but I think they're looking far beyond that. Like, we have open AI and the scale of data that they're dealing with is so huge that it isn't possible for humans to curate that. And, for data poisoning, it would actually be really trivial to mess that up. Like for example, images, you don't even need to really manipulate anything. You could just copy an image a million times and then, you've basically bombed your model training because you have a million of the same case, or, with very trivial changes to it or something like that. So I think they're really trying to get ahead of like not just things you would code, but these are like operational sorts of measures that organizations need to take. Like, how do you secure your infrastructure? I like the supply chain idea. And then for like performance drift and things like that, it's sort of reminds me of a potential PEBCAC situation where, you know, you might be like, oh, hey, let's augment our training in this category because our telemetry shows us users are really looking at this particular sort of case. And then they might actually be unintentionally biasing their models without even knowing it. And, you know, without, for example, actually confirming like, oh yeah, like for example, for cancer, like, oh yes, the NCI designated cancer centers are indeed seeing this happen, rather than just, you know, going by their own sort of surveys. I don't know. I think they're trying to be extremely forward looking here.
Yeah, and I guess they have pretty high expectations, right? When you're doing a clinical performance or a non-clinical performance study, in terms of like saying, hey, we have representative data, it's high quality, it has these inclusion exclusion criteria, and so forth. And I guess one way to look at this would be like, you should have that not only at the study time, but also when you're doing training, have those same kinds of levels of quality assurance, and then also in monitoring if you're, well, yeah, just also in monitoring also.
Just thinking a little bit about like, apart from mitigations that you can build around the model and its inference, I'm trying to think like, what are mitigations that you could actually, like for a data supply chain tampering event, what are mitigations you actually could even do? Like, especially if it's upstream of you, you know, I'm not exactly sure what that would be, except to try and detect anomalous behavior, but kind of by definition, this is behavior you aren't knowledgeable of and can't trigger until some very specific edge case occurs by design. So I'm not like, it's good to think about these things, but I guess I'm also not sure what the mitigation actually could be, apart from like a higher level mitigation surrounding the model and its outputs and the way they're interpreted.
Like I think you'll have like with medical images, you probably have to have a pretty good sense of like what the data looks like the example that Kris gave, you know, like how you can inject this like subtle pixel differences to make the model think about something else. But maybe if you had some code that took the histograms of all those images and then you see that all of a sudden, you know, there's like a new peak or something, you know, that then maybe you can spot it that way. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, adding to that, like an example I think Matt gave where there was like an X in the bottom of an X-ray, and maybe that X was associated with patients with cancer. And then the model is, when it's trained, it recognizes that, hey, if there's this X in this corner, it means cancer. And then your model is biased for that. You know, maybe more sinister, there's this noise pattern in a section of the image. I can't imagine this happening, but maybe a data broker on all their images that are diagnosed with cancer, they put a little noise stamp in every single case, and then you can train on that. You'll never know. You'll find that your model predicts really well patients with cancer. Maybe one way to figure out if that's happening is there are ways to investigate the features of an image that are contributing to the prediction. I forget the term given to that, but essentially it shows that the model, based on the model weights, what is contributing to the model's prediction. And if there's something that's just like fishy happening, like, you know, it's focusing on the corner of an image, like that is evidence that your model's biased. So there are ways to do that. I don't think it's done enough. Probably should be done a little bit more. And again, this is all assuming that you have doubt in the supply chain. So
I guess like maybe in addition to that, like redundancy, like don't get both your training and validation data sets on gradient health. Like having diversity in the data suppliers seems like maybe another way to hedge. Like I'm trying even like maybe there's even cases where it wouldn't happen maliciously, but like gradients, like data processing system or something, like certain attributes cause it to. I can imagine scenarios where systemic bias in your data sets could happen at the provider level if conditions were right or a certain bug happened, even absent of any malicious intent.
Yeah, now I'm thinking about it, I think unintentional is actually more likely. Like there was not medical, but there was an incident with one of the, you know, AI models overfitting on images for, is it Shutterstock or one of the Getty images. It was reproducing the Getty images logo and images because obviously that's in some of the training data. I could see Gradient Health or something trying to put a digital watermark on things and that unintentionally getting linked.
Yeah, yeah. Still like kind of with Reece, I'm like wondering like what are the like practical like security related controls that you would use for some of the stuff, because a lot of like the prospective like data analysis for the potential of snooping, like yeah, I mean I guess I'm not really saying anything besides just when you get the data, have it delivered over encrypted channels and get a checksum like JP suggested. But I'm also wondering, like from like a security controls point of view, like what can you really do besides trust the sender and demand encryption?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't like strictly a technical mitigation, but I know for OTS software and like cloud service providers, we have vendor validation where there's like a checklist of things that you look at for every single vendor that you interact with. I could imagine like the list of things that you would check getting longer for to mitigate against like a supply chain thing there. But yeah, I mean, I feel like that would be things we'd be doing anyway. Like that would just get captured by regular, I don't know, yeah, I don't know that this guidance necessarily changes what people would do for there.
Yeah. Well, I guess this is kind of like a lot of other like security risk assessment sorts of things that you do. There's a long list of potential things, but at the end you kind of look at it and say, is this likely enough to even include as part of my assessment? And then is it substantial enough to, or is it, no, you're not supposed to use the word likely in security. Is it exploitable enough to warrant being included in the assessment? And then is severity high enough to have a control in combination with the exploitability? Because a lot of these things might just be like, well, we trust our supplier and they handed it to me on a thumb drive, so I don't have to worry about data poisoning, or something like that. Anyhow, I'm going to move on. So there was some recommendations in this guidance, in particular, like security use case views. They're recommending having specific ones for AI. Potentially some of those, I guess, could be the same security use case views for not AI functionality. They're just related to network encryption or encryption at rest. The security risk assessment and reports that we make, it would probably be helpful to have some kind of questions to prompt these kinds of thoughts about whether some of the things that we talked about are likely and warrant controls if they're not there. They also said they were pretty concerned about data vulnerability and leakage. I don't know if this is true. I probably we should have default security mitigations for AI devices. Yeah, and then so these are coming from what they specifically were suggesting in this cybersecurity section of the AI document. And then we only have 10 minutes left, and this one could be also, I think, a longer discussion. But they said they would like an explanation regarding how the cybersecurity testing is appropriate that you do for your device to address the risks associated with the model, including fuzz testing and penetration testing, which I know some services, like we are often already do penetration testing, for example, for cyber devices. And a lot of the companies offering those services additionally, I think, provide some testing related to ML models specifically. And I'm just curious what people think about this and what their interpretation is, because it would kind of, I would hate to see an extra, like, I don't know, thousands of dollars just kind of tacked on to every single 510K. I'm just kind of making up a number in terms of like if there's the additional cost of ML penetration testing for as part of the usual penetration testing.
I'm guessing, I'm not sure. I didn't read. I only read the cybersecurity section, but maybe it talks about it somewhere else. But I'm guessing when they say penetration testing here, they mostly mean like in the context of where the AI model is deployed, not like fuzz testing the actual or penetration testing the actual, model fuzz testing or penetration testing, the actual inputs and outputs, like trying to get the model to behave in unexpected ways in a vacuum. I'm guessing that's not what they're talking about, because that I feel like wouldn't be that useful. Right? Is that other people's read on that as well?
That would be my read as well.
Yeah.
Like, I'm trying to think of like a real use case, but like where if somehow the model is like exposed, I don't know, like where the model is more directly exposed to, like this is really contrived, but like let's say you have a API that you can send results through, and then it's doing real-time training. Like you could like send I don't know, like you could use the fact that it's doing real-time training to like mess with it. Like
yeah.
I don't know.
I'm thinking if you include like the large language models in on this. So for example, like guardrails, like socially we have guardrails so that open like ChatGPT or whatever won't tell you how to make a bomb or, such things like that. Medically, you could kind of imagine similar things where, like, for example, HIPAA related things, like you should only have access to certain patients' data. But if you could phrase your question in a certain way and somehow get beyond that barrier, then you would have improper access. That might be an example. Or that, if you're only supposed to have orders that, have a confirmed diagnosis or something like that, but you were able to phrase your question and fool it into executing or at least entering an order that doesn't make sense, then that's sort of like, I mean, it's a different definition of what penetration is like when compared to what we normally think. But it's basically jailbreaking. And, again, I think they're trying to just be really forward looking about what is every potential thing that could happen and how can we design guidance for when that eventually does, even if it's not like real soon.
Yeah. I feel like on one level, it's like hard to disagree with any of the new quote requirements that like they say at minimum the following tests. It's hard to disagree with them because it's like, okay, like the more security, the better. Who would say no to that? But like in practice, I am a little worried when they say at minimum like, I don't know. There's so many cases where I think fuzz testing and penetration testing with AI models is just, yeah, not that useful. I mean, I also don't see how this, yeah, I don't know why this is like in a document about AI in particular. Like this is just, I feel like their cybersecurity guidance around just regular software development kind of already captures this type of risk. I don't know. Like, yeah.
I definitely agree. Like, I don't know why the fact that there is an AI component in the model just so happens to necessitate pen testing and fuzz testing, whereas if the same device didn't have AI, like it wouldn't. Like it
Yeah.
seems like it's almost an implement. I mean, it is an implementation detail, so it seems kind of odd to use that as a trigger for certain kinds of testing.
Well,
Yeah, I agree on the penetration
Like
testing
if
part.
oh, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I was just saying, like, for penetration testing, for example, like, if there's an API and it just so happens, if there's an API endpoint, it just so happens to forward the image onto an ML model. I don't really, and a user is not supposed to have access to that API endpoint given their credentials. I don't see how that's unique to what the API endpoint does, and I'm not really sure what fuzz testing gets you though.
I mean, like if you like replaced the AI model with algorithm, just like some complex, just for loops and some mathematical algorithm, I would feel like if there were any specific guidances around AI, it would have to be cases that wouldn't apply to the algorithm version, but would apply to AI specifically, right? Like I don't know, I can see there being like, especially if like the model can change, I can see there being additional, but I don't know. It sounds like they aren't clearing a lot of those kind of devices anyway. Most of our devices aren't like that.
Yeah, it's like for penetration testing, I just really can't think of anything. Like even if there's something that exposes something about the model, it's like that should be guarded by an admin flag or whatever. That's not really unique to
Wouldn't it go back to like what Kris was saying about like guardrails, and like I would think it'd be a different type of penetration test. Like the thing that you're trying to bypass is a different domain.
I agree. Like if we're thinking about the usual cybersecurity, you could just, I mean, it's good to include it in the AI related cybersecurity, but you would just refer to your regular cybersecurity document for those particular sections. And I think they're giving you an out here because it's like an explanation regarding how it's appropriate. So if it's appropriate not to do it because it doesn't make sense, then I think it's perfectly viable to say so and just not do it.
They mentioned the adversarial testing specific to the model. Wonder if that would be a reasonable additional test.
Wait, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, in the guidance, it talks also about adversarial testing, which I'm not exactly sure, but it looks like that can be pointed to challenge the model itself.
Yeah, the adversarial thing is related to the model evasion, where you manipulate the input image and you get some ridiculous answer out. I mean, that for those kinds of models, perhaps that is a reasonable thing to try.
Yeah, I think, and this is where like a lot of it kind of is coupled, is you to do that, you either have to be able to test that model, tons of images to figure out what an adversarial is, or you have to have some kind of access to details about the model. Like let's say it's an open model pulled off the shelf or something like that, where there's known adversarials, and you can somehow discover that fact through inappropriate access.
Could the future look like something like GE, Siemens, and others, have like this watermark, very sophisticated watermark that they only share how to decrypt it with, approved vendors, and then that's how you know that your input data is good?
In the journalism space, there was a similar thing for DSLRs to help like verify that the images that news organizations were getting were legitimate. And I think Nikon had like a special model just for that, where it would include in the JPEG tags like some sort of like a fingerprint based on the pixels of the image and other things about the camera. I would think that a medical device would do something similar, not actually mess with the image, but use the image to fingerprint something that you could verify rather than mess with the image itself.
I wonder, I'm curious what people think about if our strategy when submitting 510Ks would change at all with the addition of this new little text here. I'm guessing, because my understanding of our current default strategy for most clients is to submit without penetration testing and then let the FDA request it.
Oh,
go ahead, David.
I would say I think there's like some cases where you can make a case that it's not needed, like if it's a model running in a Docker container, like body check was. But I think it's really unlikely for like if we have like a web app hosted in the cloud that you'd be able to not do pen testing. I think just based on what I'm seeing on a number of them, I think it'd be very unlikely they would go for that. I guess like since I'm talking already, a couple other comments. I definitely interpreted this not to mean that there'd be like you would do pen testing in a case when you wouldn't otherwise. Like I interpreted this more to mean make sure the scope of your pen testing would cover any risks related to the models, similarly for the fuzz testing. So not that it would like necessarily trigger it, but I also can't think of any real cases where it matters. With maybe the really far out there case if you had an AI agent that you could like try and like do penetration testing to trick the like AI agent to do something like, but that, I mean, we're so far from that at this point, that seems a little out there, but I guess that would seem like maybe a case where your pen testing approach might like you'd be like trying to fool the model, and that's a little different than maybe the main pen test usually go. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, the guardrail thing that Kris and Josh, you guys brought up, I think that makes that makes sense to me. And I guess that would kind of be expanding the scope of what penetration testing means a little. So I mean, that's one, but like, I think I can think of examples outside of medical imaging that, like, oh yeah, guardrails for, okay, don't say when you, ask ChatGPT about things like suicide or something, like have guardrails around it. But I'm like wondering what specific things in, like, I don't know, like image segmentation model or something. Well, like what would the guardrails there look like, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm kind of with David that, like, I mean, I think that there's risks that are specific to ML models, like getting in, like, let's say you have an endpoint that gives you some information about the model or something like that, and then you can go run away with that. But I can't think of risks that are specific to ML models that also aren't covered by penetration testing. And I'm happy to interpret it that way rather than rather than seeing it as like a new penetration testing that we have to do in addition to our existing.
For some reason, thinking about penetration testing with that's AI specific made me think of writing a Django authentication middleware that's an LLM that acts like a troll under the bridge or something. You have to convince it that you do indeed need access or something. Can you convince the LLM it's worth it?
42.
Yeah, there you go. That's the AI specific pen test, the Django troll.
I just had one last side thought that's not related to pen testing, but all the other things like the supply and operational things. We usually think of a problem as being very obvious, like it's calling our patient a panda bear or something like that. But I think actually the far bigger danger is very subtle adulterations of the model that decrease its performance by a little bit. It would be akin to, like, in a drug manufacturing plant, just adding a little bit more filler into the pill so it doesn't actually have 100% of the dose that you intended. It might be 90% or something that's a whole lot less perceptible. I think that's probably the bigger danger. And yeah, one last tie into that, it's sort of like related to how viruses spread. Like the viruses that are extremely virulent, they don't get very far because they kill their patients way too quickly before they have a chance to spread or do their damage. It's the ones that are pervasive are the ones that don't kill you. They're the ones who just annoy you and they leave you alive and you don't do anything about them.
Well, on that note, yeah, I think that, I mean, if you read this as like it's just a heap of new documentation that we have to do, it kind of seems like a lot, but that's, I don't think, the intent. I think it's like, consider all these things. There's all these new potentials, and then maybe document that you've considered them, but you don't necessarily have to go and add a bunch of controls for every potential risk that you can cook up, even if it's not likely. So anyhow, yeah, thanks everybody for the discussion. I think this was interesting.
Great topic.
Oh, and if anybody has
good.
strong opinions and strong thoughts, I think maybe we should get them together and maybe submit for comment if we feel like there's changes that we might want to make or suggestions that we want to make.
Yeah, awesome topic.
That was great.
All right, yeah, I will catch everyone later. Have a nice one.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.